welcome back to the Daily Poem. I'm David Kern. Before we get started, I just want to say thank you for being patient with me this weekend. As many of you know, North Carolina, where we are situated here at the Cersei Institute and the Close Reads Podcast Network, is right in line, or I guess was right in line for Hurricane Florence. So we were being cautious with our comings and goings over the last few days. So I appreciate your patience as you waited for this first episode of this week. Today's poem is by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, one of the most famous and successful poets of his time, and a poet who was quite popular during his life. Longfellow is known for several book-length poems, including Evangeline, also a long poem called Hiawatha. He's known for the courtship of Miles Standish and other poems. But many of you probably know him for one of two things: either the short poem Paul Revere's Ride, which was written around the time of the beginning of the Civil War and was a call for steadfastness as the war was beginning. And then you also might know him for his translation of Dante's Divine Comedy. He was the first, he produced the first American translation of the Divine Comedy. And by the time he died in 1882, he was the most famous poet in America. His 75th birthday, was actually celebrated all across the country. So unlike many poets, such as Emily Dickinson and Keats, for example, to name just two, he actually reached a pretty high level of fame and success during his life, to the extent that he was able to largely live off of his writing the last couple of decades. The poem that I'm going to read today is called "The Tide Rises and the Tide Falls," and it felt somehow appropriate. It was on the schedule anyway for this week, but it feels appropriate to read this sort of poem when living in the wake, I suppose, of a hurricane whose waters are still receding. So with that in mind, here is "The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls" by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The tide rises, the tide falls. The twilight darkens, the curlew calls. Along the sea sands damp and brown, the traveler hastens toward the town, and the tide rises, the tide falls. Darkness settles on roofs and walls, but the sea in the darkness calls. The little waves, with their soft white hands, efface the footprints in the sands, and the tide rises, the tide falls. The morning breaks. The steeds in their stalls stamp and neigh as the hostler calls. The day returns, but never more returns the traveler to the shore, and the tide rises, the tide falls. There's something obviously ominous about this poem in some ways. I've always found it to be a little haunting and also maybe have a little tint of adventure in there as well. And I've been thinking a lot about how the alliteration in the poem might be playing into that. I'm going to read it again, as I usually do. And one thing to look for is just the sheer volume of the S sound. The way I read it, that probably comes across through a microphone even more so than it would if we were just reading it in a room together, the way the microphone picks up the sounds. But I think that's really interesting, the way he used that sound itself to create tone, to enhance the tone and the mood of what he's kind of trying to say in the poem. So, once more, "The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls" by Longfellow. The tide rises, the tide falls. The twilight darkens, the curlew calls. Along the sea sands, damp and brown, the traveler hastens toward the town, and the tide rises, the tide falls. Darkness settles on roofs and walls, but the sea in darkness calls. The little waves, with their soft white hands, efface the footprints in the sands, and the tide rises, the tide falls. The morning breaks. The steeds in their stalls stamp and neigh as the hostler calls. The day returns, but never more returns the traveler to the shore, and the tide rises, the tide falls. This has been another episode of the Daily Poem. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back tomorrow with another poem.